Appreciate you guys joining in. Appreciate you guys listening. We're back for another episode. We've got David Pyne coming on. It's going to be a great interview, great piece of information, and it's going to be very informative. Just waiting for the YouTube to go live. It says it's live. Okay, here we are. Brilliant. Okay, and then I just need to... There we go. Okay, brilliant. Okay, that should be working for you guys on YouTube, on X and on YouTube. Let me know if it's not. If someone can check the X stream and let me know if it's working in terms of audio. If you can. Okay, brilliant. It's working. Excellent. Okay, we tried something different there today, and I think it's working. Okay. Okay, so we're gonna let me get. Oh, brilliant. He's on. Hi, David. How are you doing? How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much. I just want to welcome David Pyne onto the show. He is the Executive Director, EMP Task Force. A wealth of experience. I was looking through your background and it was immense. Thank you so much for taking your time out to join us. How are you?
Doing good. Hope you're doing good as well.
Yeah, doing great. Thank you so much for asking. So, David, we want to get right into it. We've got some breaking news. Apparently, Trump, this has been reported by Axios, so take it with however you want, but Axios are reporting that Trump is planning to restart the war with a limited invasion or limited bombing campaign in order to soften the Iranians to get them to come back into a deal. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's a terrible plan. I think that it's self-defeating. President Trump's war in Iran is it's unwinnable. It's unnecessary. It's unconstitutional. It's illegal. It's really accomplished nothing but suffering. I think for the Iranian people, for the American people, for the globe at large, and so he campaigned to be a transformational peace president, and he's done the exact opposite. He's joined the neocons, what we call the deep state here in America, and the globalists. He's been a bully in trying to prosecute this war. Iran never directly attacked us. We had Secretary of War Pete Hegseth report to Congress today that Iran, in fact, did not pose an imminent threat to the United States. In fact, based on what he said, it didn't pose a threat to the U.S. at all, because he said that not only was there was the Iranian nuclear program obliterated in the June Operation Midnight Hammer airstrikes, but that it only had aspirations to become a nuclear power, and that it was reportedly Trump attacked Iran because it was at its weakest that's ever been. So if in fact it was true that Iran was weak, the U.S. had absolutely no basis whatsoever from a national security perspective to go to war against it.
Yeah, you're referring to what Pete Hegseth said today, right? Which is, it was crazy. He said that they were never close to a nuclear bomb, and it was just that they were slow walking towards a nuclear bomb. And what does slow walking mean? What is the time frame? I mean, what does this say about the motives behind it? Many are claiming that this kind of adds to the notion that this war was essentially not for the United States of America, but for Israel.
I think that's absolutely right. It was Benjamin Netanyahu that came to the Situation Room to brief Trump on February 11th, and essentially did a hard sell on President Trump. The only cabinet officer or secretary that reportedly thought it was a good idea to go to war with Iran was Pete Hegseth. And Pete Hegseth, of course, Trump's sycophant. He knows that if he doesn't endear himself to Trump, he's going to be out, because he's had kind of a scandalous past and a not a good tenure as war secretary. But everyone else opposed it. Vice President Vance opposed it, and so it was Israel, essentially the Israel lobby, I think, that got Trump to start this war. Again, it's unwinnable. There's no the only exit strategy essentially is it's really two possibilities. Either we pull all our forces out of the Middle East, of the Persian Gulf region, and essentially call a truce on that basis, or else we sign a peace deal with Iran that is substantially on their terms, a true reasonable compromise agreement, not the maximalist demands that President Trump has been calling for the past few weeks.
And in terms of those maximalist demands that we're seeing, we saw, for example, there's this information that's coming out about this first meeting. And I've spoken to even people within the negotiation team, and they're saying that there was a lot of movement. There were points that were agreed upon. And then there were points, obviously, that weren't agreed upon, but they were discussing it. And there was this kind of roadmap to maybe possibly getting there. If me and you were discussing things, there's a chance we're going to get to a conclusion, especially if we agree to certain things and then disagree to other things. And then obviously the reports are that Netanyahu got on the phone with Kushner and killed the deal. And so I guess the question here is, the US has then reverted back to saying, look, these are our demands, accept it or not. And what does that say about the negotiation, that those are the kind of parameters by which the negotiations are being conducted?
Well, as the government of Iran has stated, it's the loser doesn't get to set the terms. And in war, the winner of a war has traditionally been the country that retains control of the area in dispute. And in this case, the area in dispute is between the U.S. and Iran has been the Persian Gulf region and the Strait of Hormuz. So the U.S. Navy, the mightiest conventional navy in the world, has been unable to dislodge, Iranian control over the strait. And that's why Trump has gone epileptic and trying to demand that Iran return that control of the strait to international shipping, and end the toll booth process with this blockade. But it just really shows how Iran has emerged from this war more powerful at the strategic level as essentially the regional hegemon of the Persian Gulf that I warned about 21 years ago in my published articles, and it's Trump that made it happen. Trump hasn't. Yes, he's weakened Iran in terms of destroying 50% of their missile launchers, 1/3 of their air force, 40% of their naval fleet, but Iran still possesses thousands of missiles, a few of which may be nuclear, because I do believe that there is evidence that Iran has nuclear weapons, but they've proven a responsible nuclear power. They haven't used nuclear weapons. They haven't threatened to use nuclear weapons. And so there was no imminent threat. There was no viable national security rationale to start this war. Trump needs to back out of it and come to some kind of reasonable compromise agreement with Iran, because if he decides to invade Kark Island, for example, we're going to lose thousands of U.S. military casualties in short order.
You just kind of shocked me there. You said that you believe Iran has nuclear weapons. Please elaborate and illuminate why you believe that to be the case.
Yeah, so there was an article published in 2016 by one of my predecessors here at the Task Force on National and Homeland Security, and his name was Dr. Peter Pyne, a very senior U.S. national nuclear expert, along with others, James Woolsey, former CIA director, and others, and they concluded that Iran, likely has had the ability to produce nuclear weapons since 2003, and that they acted on that and produced some kind of, they likely had a modest nuclear force in place by 2016. So, there are reasons why Iran would choose not to disclose that. They've also deployed satellites at optimum attack vector for a super EMP attack on the U.S. homeland. So I think the bottom line that I'm trying to press home here is that Iran has lots of cards to play. They have lots of weapons, cyber attack, cyber offensive capabilities they could use to paralyze U.S. critical infrastructure here in the United States, even if you don't think they have nuclear weapons, that they've chosen not to use yet. So the idea that Iran is near collapse, as Trump proclaimed on Truth Social, is really quite ridiculous.
I guess now coming back to what you're referring to, the this claim by Trump that he destroyed the Navy, the Air Force, and various other things. As you have stated, like this quite clearly isn't the case. They hit some, and obviously the amount is debated. For example, CNN claimed it was 50% of the missile launches, and then they said, but they've managed to get that back up to 70%, as in they only have 30% that have been removed, and that's according to them. According to Iranian sources, the numbers are a lot less. And I guess the question mark here is if they've been bombing for 39 days, and now you see a huge military buildup and a plan to restart the bombing campaign as per the report by Axios. And we know Barack Ravid of Axios has a direct line to Donald Trump. He's relaying whatever Trump tells him to relay. It seems he's basically telling everyone they plan to bomb again for a short period of time. What's the objective? What's the goal?
Well, I think we have to take everything that President Trump states with a grain of salt, because he also threatened to nuke Iran. Essentially, he threatened to destroy all of Iran's entire civilization in a single night. There's the only way that he could do that is with the use of nuclear weapons. So he's made a lot of threats that have proven to be bluffs. My personal assessment is he is tired of this war. The Wall Street Journal reported that he's sick of the war. He wants to move on. He just doesn't, he's kind of flailing around, not knowing how to end it. He thought that the naval blockade would help to pressure Iran to accept his maximalist peace terms. But the IMF is estimating that Iran's economy, their GDP will only go down by about 6.4% by the end of the year if the naval blockade continues. And that's something with 9% unemployment. I mean, that's something that Iran can endure. I mean, this is an existential war of independence against U.S. and Israeli imperialism from the Iranian perspective.
You mentioned existential war. J.D. Vance today said it is an existential war for him as well. I mean, what's your thoughts on that? How is this an existential war for the United States of America?
Well, it's only existential if we escalate it, because if we escalate it, then Iran has maximum incentive to destroy the U.S. homeland, or rather our critical infrastructure, using cyber, super EMP, or even partial nuclear attacks. So, it's ironic, I think, that this war is supposedly was fought on the purpose of reducing the national security threat posed by Iran to America. And in fact, U.S. actions have served to maximize, again, the incentives to provoke Iran to, for example, stage a massive cyber attack that could take down most or even all of our critical infrastructure, including the electrical power grid. So why President Trump wants to pursue this potentially suicidal strategy in fighting an ever-escalating war against Iran is quite beyond me.
Especially when Iran doesn't want that, right? Iran hasn't demonstrated that it ever was considered the United States of America as a threat, never acted in that manner. And actually, historically, you see, Iran was always open to this possibility of having trade throughout the world, including the United States of America. And so this kind of manufactured threat, when it isn't for Americans and actually risking the lives of Americans, which I don't think Iran would, but you're right, if it does become existential, if Iran wanted to, they could do all of these attacks on America, and yet they're not doing so. And we're seeing the American people are turning on Trump. His poll numbers are extremely low, and even those poll numbers are completely manipulated. I think the real numbers are even lower. What's your thoughts on what Trump does now? Because as you said, he's stuck. He's stuck between a rock and a hard place. He wants a deal, but he doesn't want to give Iran what they kind of are asking for. He's not willing to go against these extreme demands that he has for Israel because of Israel. At the same time, you mentioned he can bomb, but what more can they do?
Well, not a whole lot. I think we really kind of blew our wad essentially with the massive airstrikes that we conducted, reportedly against 13,000 Iranian targets. And Iran has proven very resilient. They could fight this war for years. I don't think we can. J.D. Vance reportedly, the Vice President of the United States, has expressed profound concern that with the loss or the expenditure of 50% of our missile defense interceptors, 30% of our Tomahawks, and tens of billions of dollars of other weapon systems, that the U.S. is now unable to deter a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Not only can we not fight a war against China now in the Western Pacific, thanks to Trump's war, but we certainly could never win it, and potentially not be able to deter it. So we've essentially created a huge geostrategic problem for the United States, in that we are transforming ourselves from one of the most powerful conventional military superpowers in the world into more of a paper tiger that just doesn't have the capabilities to fight a great power war. Now, I consider Iran to be a great power, because I think any country that has nuclear weapons, as I believe Iran does, is a great power. I would say it's a secondary great power. Obviously, the U.S. and Israel have far more nuclear weapons than Iran potentially does. But China is a different story. U.S. intelligence has reported that China is building a nuclear arsenal that well in excess of what the U.S. deploys today. And I believe they have a nuclear superiority over the U.S., and Russia's nuclear superiority over the U.S. is far more pronounced. And unlike the U.S., they have hundreds of, Russia has up to 10,000 theater nuclear weapons. China at least has several hundred, and the U.S. has none deployed in the Western Pacific. So once again, the U.S. is very ill prepared to counter the Chinese threat, thanks to President Trump.
Yeah, and that's a bigger issue. And let's kind of go into that. You look at the United States of America, and by going into this war, they've weakened their entire geopolitical strength. And so what I mean by that is, let's look at each element. You got Japan. Japan's now trying to make deals with Iran to try and get oil. You've got UAE yesterday announcing that they're going to leave OPEC. You've seen the Gulf states moving more towards China. You've seen many countries moving more towards China because of what's happening, where America hasn't been able to protect them, both militarily in terms of the GCC, but also financially or economically, in the sense of what's happening with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. How bad a decision was this, and is this the end of the U.S. empire as we know it?
Yeah, I predicted at the beginning of the war that this war would transform the regional and global power balance against the United States, and I think that's exactly what we've seen. Russia and China are stronger; they're making more money, as certainly Russia is, with the sanctions lifted on their oil shipments. And Iran, up until the blockade, was making more money as well, shipping more oil to China. And they have the capability to weather this blockade, I think, much more effectively than the U.S. does. It's been a geostrategic disaster for the United States of the first order. I agree with Dr. Robert Pape, who said it's probably the worst military disaster for the U.S. At the strategic level, at least since the Vietnam War.
You mentioned Robert Pape. He still is under the belief and or impression that he believes there's going to be a ground invasion, that this is going to escalate to a point where, he claims it's an escalation trap where it continues to escalate, and so we'll end up in a ground invasion. Do you really still believe that, or do you think that Trump's now convinced himself that this is just not possible?
I think it's highly unlikely that we see a ground invasion based on the article, the Wall Street Journal. If we're to believe that article indicated that Trump went apoplectic when we lost even one airman, a special forces colonel, weapons officer, an F-15 Strike Eagle that was shot down over Iran. He said, send 200 special forces to go rescue the guy. So, because he was so worried that his presidency would be compared to Jimmy Carter, who had 52 U.S. embassy hostages for well over a year that were captured and held hostage by Iran. So. I think we're hearing a lot of these threats, all the bluff and bluster from President Trump, but I think it's still unlikely that he restarts the war. I know, he's got these threats posted on Axios. I think those are kind of controlled leaks to the press to try to, pressure Iran. But Iran is not going to be pressured. Whether he chooses to restart the war or even stage a ground invasion and take Karg Island at the cost of thousands of U.S. casualties, it's not going to change the ultimate calculus, which is, the Iranian regime is going to fight this war indefinitely because, again, it is an existential war and it's a war of independence from U.S. and Israeli imperialism. Because President Trump has stated this is not a war to liberate the Iranian people; it's a war to, essentially to conquer them and to pick their leaders and steal their oil. So it's not a humanitarian war at all.
So you mentioned that you don't believe Trump can escalate, and actually there is a lot of people who initially thought escalation may happen and kind of now not as sure. I spoke to Larry Johnson this week. He's not as convinced anymore. A few other people I can't remember now. I spoke to this week and they were who were adamant that there was going to be kinetic war and now less sure that there is going to be kinetic war. But then it comes back to, if there's no kinetic war, then there's negotiation. And the issue you got with it is, for example, you look at the two main components of that, which is the nuclear enrichment and the Strait of Hormuz. I think the ballistic missiles are a third component, which I think Israel would never allow, and I think Iran would never give up. So I think that was always the point where there would always be talks, would always collapse, unless you kick it down to the future. But then if you kick it down to the future, America and Israel may come back again. But I guess on those two things, how can they ever get a deal? Because Trump can never sell this to his people. Because I see it on all American podcasts. I'm in America a lot, and he's been battered about the fact that the Strait of Hormuz is under the control of Iran. And so how can he ever reframe that as a win without ever getting an actual substantive win?
Well, I think President Trump has shown an amazing ability to persuade his, what few remain of his mega supporters that this is a victory. Hegseth has said it's a wonderful victory. It's one of the greatest victories in U.S. military history. Trump has said as much, and so I think he really does have the capability to spin some kind of compromise deal in which the U.S. accepts most Iranian terms as a victory, and he could do that because Iran has already offered to suspend nuclear enrichment for a 5-year period. I mean that's a concession that I didn't expect to see on the Iranian side, and the U.S. is reportedly calling for 10 to 20 year suspension. But that is, that's really, we're kind of within, an area where a true compromise can be reached. The other issue, of course, is the highly enriched uranium, of which Iran has reportedly has about 1,000 pounds, enough to build 12 to 15, atomic bombs. They're wanting to dilute that under U.S. verification. U.S. inspectors, Trump is demanding they return it to the U.S. He could make that concession as well. You could say, yeah, we'll let you dilute it as long as it's destroyed, as long as you have zero highly enriched uranium stockpile, then that's a win. So I mean, those are clearly areas where he could claim victory, even though he's had maximalist demands that are insisting on much more. The issue of the Strait, of course, is a little different. There's no way he can dislodge Iran from that. They're not going to give that up. They know that control of the Strait of Hormuz is really their only pressure point, their only way to ensure that the U.S. doesn't, restart the war 8 months from now. And so they're going to retain that, and they're going to do those tolls. We could get them to reduce their tolls from $1 a barrel to maybe 75 cents a barrel potentially, but it really doesn't matter. It's what the toll is irrelevant. We just want to see the shipping, return to in terms of the freedom of navigation, even if it's IRGC Navy controlled. So again, I think that Trump could spin that as a win just by saying, we got them to reopen the Strait. I mean, we've seen him say so many lies during this war. This war has essentially been a war of lies, just as Biden's war in Ukraine has been against Russia. It's a proxy war with Russia and China, and there's just no reason to continue fighting it. But If the MAGA supporters believe his lies that are just completely ridiculous, completely false, I do think he could easily spin a compromise deal as a win to his supporters.
In terms of the nuclear, in a world where nuclear energy is so important, especially when we look at the problems oil that can result in oil issues. We saw the Strait being closed and how many countries are having problems due to oil. And it just adds to this notion or this idea how important nuclear energy is. And so Iran has been very clear that it's their sovereign right, that they need nuclear energy. So Trump's asking for 0%. We know the JCPO was around 3.69 or 3.99%. How can you ever have a scenario where there's a better deal than even Obama's? I know that would be Trump's ideal situation where he gets a better deal than Obama. How could they do that? I did speak to the negotiator. I spoke to Professor Morandi. He said that the 5-year, 20-year kind of restrictions was reported by mainstream media, but it was false. But I mean, that's what Professor Morandi told me. But just on the nuclear enrichment, how can they come to a deal? Because Iran needs nuclear enrichment and there can't be any kind of block on it. And what I mean by that is if Iran was to give a 5-year pause or even a 20-year pause, they're going to put themselves back compared to anybody else in the world, especially when we look at the movement of society, the movement of infrastructure. They'll again cause themselves great harm. Why would they agree to that?
Well, I think Iran likely does have a much larger stockpile of low-enriched uranium, and obviously if they were to convert the 1,000 pounds of highly enriched uranium to low-enriched uranium, that would give them sufficient nuclear fuel to last for some period of time. I don't know how long, but I strongly suspect they have sufficient. The reason they gave the 5-year period is they have sufficient low-enriched uranium to fuel their nuclear reactors over that 5-year period. So I think that's probably their best and final offer, and I think Trump would be wise to accept it. But you're absolutely right. Under international law, every country in the world has the right to have nuclear reactors and to engage in low uranium enrichment up to 3.67%, which I think is the percentage in the JCPOA.
Now, in terms of from a military aspect, obviously this is one of your main expertise. We've seen a huge buildup of military prowess in the region, much more bigger than even when he started this war. And so can all of that be just for negotiation is the first part of the question. And the second part of the question is this, that in terms of, sorry, if you answer that, then I'll ask the second question, sorry.
Yeah, so President Trump has been, he's used the ceasefire period to continue amassing, U.S. air and naval power in the region, including, probably 10 to 12,000 ground troops for potential ground invasion of Iranian-held islands in the Persian Gulf. And it's crazy to think about, but, the way President Trump works and the way he thinks is this is all leverage. He's trying to use maximum threats and maximum leverage, whether it's nuclear attack to kill up to 92 million Iranian civilians, or whether it's threatening to destroy all their power plants and most of their oil refineries. These are all ways that he, in his mind, and I don't think it works this way, are pressure points for to kind of scare Iran to accept his maximalist peace terms, and we've seen it just hasn't worked. Iran is. He's claimed that Iran has, their leadership is badly divided. There's the moderates and the hardliners. Really, there's the hardliners, and then there's the more hardliners in Iran. But Iran, the key is that Iran is, they're led by rational and restrained leaders. Like you said, they have, many weapons that they could have used that are more powerful than anything they've used thus far against the U.S. homeland, and they've chosen not to use them. The irony, I think, is President Trump, everything he says about Iran is more true about the U.S. and Israel than it is about Iran. Yes, Iran has supported terrorist strikes against Israel. Yes, they killed 992 Americans with their proxies in 47 years, which is 21 a year. I mean, certainly not a major threat. China's killed far more in terms of fentanyl and COVID than Iran ever has, up to 1,600 times more. And so Iran is it's always been kind of a secondary threat. It's been more of a threat to Israel. It's been really the key blocker to Israel to claim hegemony over the entire Middle East, aside from Pakistan, and so that I think is the main rationale for the war is Israel rather than the U.S.
Yeah, and even those 900 that were killed, they weren't killed on American soil. This was American invasions into these countries, and then they were basically responding to that. But in terms of now what we look at, the current situation, we've seen previously, before this war, there was only one USS aircraft carrier. There was the USS Abraham Lincoln. And they tried to bring the Gerald Ford, and there were a number of issues on there. There were possibilities of there being a mutiny on board. But that being said, since then, we've now got possibly 2 or 3 more USS aircraft carriers. We have the USS Gerald Ford, the George Bush, and I've heard that there's possibly a 4th one as well. Again, in terms of the USS aircraft carriers being there, the reason they're there is that you can basically bomb around the clock. So again, does that not kind of give you this indication that something is coming, or do you think just all of this money that's been spent, all of this time, all of this is just a negotiation tactic?
I really think it's more of a negotiation tactic. There is certainly a realistic chance of the bombing resuming. I think Trump has that in his back pocket. I think the ground invasion option is mostly eliminated in his mind. I think he realizes that would be, turn it into another Vietnam or another Iraq war in terms of massive U.S. losses, or in Afghanistan that would be a forever war that would kind of tie us down, as Robert Pape has talked about, in an escalation trap that would make this war last indefinitely. But I think I really do believe it's more of Trump in his mind, trying to increase and maximize the amount of leverage and pressure against Iran's Islamist regime to accept Trump's maximal peace demands.
Where does this leave Israel? Because Israel right now is fighting in South Lebanon. On the ground, they're still struggling. They're receiving a number of casualties on the ground against Hezbollah. That being said, when it comes to over the air, obviously they continue to bomb South Lebanon, creating as much mass casualties as possible. But in order to take land, you need to be able to do a ground invasion. You can bomb from the air as much as you want. And so they're struggling in that. So how can they succeed in something that they failed many, many times without the support of America?
Well, I think Israel is one of the winners of this war in that their objectives are very different from our own. We want to see the war end as quickly as possible on reasonably good terms for the U.S. We want to see the Strait reopened. We want it to degrade, Iran's missile capabilities, their air force and their navy, their ability to strike out, hit U.S. military bases, which. Ironically, this war was started on the pretext of protecting our military bases from being hit, and in fact, I think we've seen 11 to 13 U.S. military bases destroyed, very predictably as a result of Trump's so-called excursion against Iran, which I consider to be a great power war, the first we fought since the Korean War. So I think for Israel, Netanyahu's main objective has been to, degrade Iran's conventional military forces, and I think that's been relatively successful. So I think he can claim a victory on that end. He could claim, the assassination of 50 top Iranian leaders as a victory, though I think that's really a net defeat for the U.S. and Israel, because the folks that are now in charge are not much more hardline, but they're certainly more hardline, more IRGC connected than the previous leadership. I think we've learned that the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was probably more in the moderate range than a hardliner, and his son, obviously, we killed his family, his wife and his father and other relatives. So he's much more hardline and open to massive retaliation against the U.S. if we choose to escalate the war. But I think the main objective that Netanyahu had in mind was to embroil the U.S. in an indefinite war against Iran. Essentially, he's using us the same way as we've been using Ukraine against Russia, which is cannon fodder. So he would love to get to see the U.S. invade Khark Island and launch a ground invasion of Iran that kind of in his mind, it reduces the threat to Israel because Iran will be bogged down fighting a full-scale war against the United States.
Okay. And you mentioned in terms of the U.S. weakening, we saw, for example, as you mentioned, the UAE now leaving OPEC, which if more countries leave OPEC, it reduces the price of oil. And if the price of oil reduces enough, this is going to be severely harmful to America, because America, it costs them a lot more to produce oil than any other country. And so you see the weakening of the American empire financially, militarily, you've seen the weakening. And you mentioned about China now. China is essentially partaking in a proxy war, but in a way that is actually being extremely beneficial to them in terms of the weakening of the United States of America. How do you see China's role in this?
Well, first I want to answer your previous question that I didn't answer before, and that is I do think there is a increasing risk that the U.S. empire will be, the graveyard of the U.S. empire will be Iran. The longer this war continues, the more likely the U.S. will lose its empire. So we've already seen that with the petrodollar and whatnot. But in terms of China, I think China again is a big winner because they now have indirect control of the strait through their Iranian proxy. It's essentially in Chinese and Russian allied hands. 20% of the oil reserves of the world travel through that strait, and Iran is getting to control what passes and what doesn't. And the Persian Gulf, of course, is now going to be permanently free of a U.S. military presence in terms of naval presence. So China could send in destroyers and essentially claim it as its own, or replace the U.S. as the superpower that has naval shipping in that area. They could build a base or simply use Iranian bases for that purpose. And as you mentioned, we've already seen the realignment of the Gulf states because the Trump administration made the decision to defend Israel, to focus its air and missile defenses on Israel rather than the Gulf states. And so the Gulf states got screwed. They got hit really hard. Our bases got destroyed. And so we had this kind of security guarantee for the our Gulf allies that was proven to be, completely misleading because we didn't defend them. So, now they're looking at the new power balance and they're seeing that Iran is the power to be reckoned with. And so they're going to be cutting deals with Iran for their security out of necessity because the U.S. has proven unable to provide their security in this war.
And that's going to be the big problem. Now, in terms of just from the weaponry perspective, we've seen Iran use Hegseth claimed that Iran had, when they'd used the missiles, it's been solely Iranian domestic missiles. They've not used any Chinese missiles. In addition to that, there are reports that, which I think are quite substantive, that Iran has used China's, for example, the Beidou system. Also, Iran has used a number of China's other anti-aircraft missiles and radars and various other things. And some of them were Iranian domestic ones. When you look at the possible success of some of those during the war, and the claim is that China hasn't given Iran its best stuff, what does that say about the risk of any potential war with with China, especially when we have a situation which I'm a big believer that the military industrial complex has taken advantage of the US, where in a sense there's been a monopolization where because of the monopoly of Raytheon, Lockheed Martin and various others, they've not produced the best equipment, they've not produced the best defenses, the best military, the best weapons. And you see with China, they're doing that. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the U.S. does have some of the best weapon systems. Raytheon and other U.S. companies produce really outstanding and highly capable weapon systems. They're more expensive than the weapon systems of our enemies, our adversaries, Russia, China, and Iran. But in many cases, they're high capability. The problem is our defense industrial base has been hollowed out since the end of the Cold War. We have perhaps 50% of the defense industrial base we had at the end of the Cold War. And so we're completely overmatched in terms of our capabilities to produce weapon systems as opposed to China. So if the U.S. were to refight the Pacific War against China, the U.S. would be playing the role of Imperial Japan in that we could, we don't even have, our fleet is completely overmatched in terms of our Pacific fleets, the third and seventh fleets, versus China's fleet, 90% of which or 95% of which is focused in the Western Pacific. So we couldn't even score some early victories like Japan did, and we would essentially be swept from the Pacific over a period of time if the war remained conventional. So I think this war has proven conclusively that the U.S. lacks the ability to successfully fight and win a war against China in the Western Pacific, because it essentially would be an air naval and missile war, and in all those capabilities, if we can't defeat a secondary great power like Iran, a second-rate great power, or retake the Strait because of the massive threat from Iranian anti-ship missiles forcing our carriers to operate 1,000 kilometers away. Iran's anti-ship missile capabilities are far in excess of that. And further, there was a couple of experts that published a piece a couple of weeks ago on the U.S. side that estimated that the U.S. would only have sufficient missile interceptors for the first 24 hours of high-intensity combat against China. So needless to say, once our carrier strike groups run out of SM-3s and SM-6s to shoot down incoming missiles, our fleets our ships are going to be forced to make a hasty withdrawal to a distance of about 1,500 miles to avoid being sunk by incoming Chinese missiles.
Yeah, no doubt. Now, David, one last question for you before we wrap up is Lebanon again. Just a quick question on that. If there is a deal, Iran is clear that any deal needs to include Lebanon. Professor Morandi explained to me that the initial negotiation, there was an understanding, there was an agreement that there would be peace in the entire region, and that meant no bombing of Israel over Gaza as well as Lebanon, and this was obviously broken. If there is a deal, the deal needs to include Lebanon according to Iran, and I think if Iran was not to do that, that would be considered a betrayal. And so from Israel's perspective, they don't want Lebanon in there. They want to try and occupy as much Lebanon as possible. And so again, on that aspect, how can they come to a deal?
Well, I think President Trump has shown some good initiative in pressuring Israel to accept a ceasefire. Granted, that ceasefire is currently a 4-week ceasefire. I think we're in the second week of a 4-week ceasefire that was just extended, I think, on the 23rd for an additional 3 weeks. So, I think President Trump is absolutely open to including, an Israel-Lebanon ceasefire as part of the peace deal. The problem is that he seems to lack control of Netanyahu, because according to Iran and Hezbollah or Lebanon, there's been 150 Israeli ceasefire violations in the past, 12 or 13 days, 2 weeks essentially. So that is definitely going to be an issue, but I think that I think President Trump would include that as part of a comprehensive peace deal with Iran. The issue is, would Israel comply? Because thus far, Trump has acted as if he's an Israeli proxy. The U.S. is an Israeli proxy, not vice versa. We've always assumed that Israel was a U.S. proxy, in the Middle East. In fact, Netanyahu has boasted about him being briefed by top U.S. officials on a daily basis, and obviously he was able to get Trump to fight this war when he tried the same hard sell with Bush, Obama, and Biden unsuccessfully. So he has manipulated President Trump to fall into his trap to fight this indefinite war against Iran. The only question is, can Trump cut his Israeli puppet strings and break free of their influence by ending the war and the blockade on reasonable terms that Iran can accept? Yeah.
But he's mentioned about the ceasefire, but the ceasefire was never real. And what I mean by that is Iran agreed to a ceasefire with the United States of America for Lebanon. And then because the Lebanese government, it was demonstrated that they were ineffective. They basically colluded with Israel to kind of create a fake ceasefire. But every single day they've bombed, and they continue to bomb South Lebanon, and there's engagement on the ground as well. So there's no real ceasefire. That whole thing is fake. So I guess I'm trying to say this notion that we've got where Israel's trying to invade South Lebanon, they put out a report saying that they want to take 8 kilometers as a buffer zone. They want to take up into the Litani River as a military zone where they control. And then, the current Lebanese government can deal with the rest of that. And I'm saying, if that, they've clearly laid out that's their plan, and they've clearly not abided by any ceasefire, because they've not abided by this ceasefire at all, how can you have a scenario where they're going to get Israel to agree to it? I just can't see that happening. I know you're saying that Trump could pressure it, but he's never been demonstrated the ability to stop Netanyahu in a real, tangible way.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's the real issue, is that Trump has not demonstrated the backbone. I mean, he even wrote on Truth Social, a few days ago that Israel was prohibited from bombing Lebanon, and we've seen Netanyahu bomb Lebanon, as you mentioned, probably every day since. So Trump is the way that he can pressure Israel, of course, is to threaten to cut off security assistance to Israel. We provide them with over $3 billion a year in foreign assistance, most of which is defense related, military assistance. We provide them with intelligence. We help shoot down Iranian missiles that are coming down on Israeli territory. He could cut off all of that, or threaten to cut all of it off. And if Netanyahu took him seriously, Netanyahu would be forced to. I think he'd be forced to comply with Trump's demands in terms of the ceasefire. The interesting thing is Iran has not demanded that Israeli troops, the IDF, be withdrawn from southern Lebanon. They've just said there needs to be a permanent ceasefire. So Iran's demands in that regard are very reasonable. And one of the issues, of course, is that Hezbollah was not a party to the ceasefire talks. So Hezbollah could credibly claim that they weren't part of the ceasefire, and they can continue striking Israeli occupation forces at will. But I don't think they would do that. I think Hezbollah is a team player with Iran. They're proven one of Iran's top allies in the region, and so if there's a ceasefire that Israel honors, Hezbollah would be sure to honor it as well.
Yeah, and my understanding is, although they weren't directly in the talks, they were involved in them in the sense, and this was confirmed by the negotiators and Hezbollah's own lawyer who I had on the show. So, but I agree with you, they weren't directly in there. But David, what a great interview. Really appreciated your time. Where can people find you? Where can people find your work, your writings, your videos or vlogs, or whatever medium people can find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Real War Substack. That's at dpyne.substack.com. Once again, dpyne.substack.com. That's where I post all of my more substantive articles on national security affairs, and then I also publish on a daily basis on X at America First Con. Once again, at America First Con. I've only got 11,000 followers, so I'd encourage all of your viewers to please follow me and get my updates. Yeah,
we'll definitely put your Twitter handle in the nest. We've got a large number of people listening to us on X right now, so we'll definitely have that in there. And people should definitely follow you. Appreciate you coming on, and we'll definitely get you back on again. Appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, Solomon. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you. That was David Pyne. Thank you. Thanks to him. What a great interview. Appreciate him coming on. Appreciate him taking his time out to give us his thoughts. Make sure you follow his Twitter. Make sure you follow his Substack. I'm going to put his X on here in a second once I get off this bit. And also, guys, make sure you like this video. Make sure you comment on this video. Comment in the main section. Let me know your thoughts of what he had to say. Like this video and subscribe to this channel and have your notifications on. And the reason I'm saying that is we have a lot of interviews lined up where I randomly just line them up. As an example, outside of our schedule, for example, on Saturday, 10 a.m. Eastern, we've got Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. So if you didn't have your notifications on, maybe you weren't listening to this, you may not know that interview is going to be happening. So we've got a number of interviews lined up. We've got about 3. We've got Ryan Dawson coming out tonight. We've got quite a few interviews lined up tomorrow. I've got a big debate on Friday. Don't want to give you the information because last time when people found out, they end up getting the debate cancelled. And then on Saturday, we've got Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, and I'm speaking to a few more people and getting them lined up as well. So like this video, subscribe to this channel, and comment in the main section. And let your friends and family know about it. I'm looking at the stats and all the boomers on here. I need some young bloods. Following this channel. So subscribe. Appreciate you. I'm going to end the YouTube and we're going to move on to the main channel, the Suleiman Ahmed X channel. That's where we're going to continue the X space.